Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us on our Wednesday, September 30th Athlete Town Hall. I'm really excited today to welcome a former Team Ontario member with Athletics Ontario, Austin Ingram. Austin is the T13 100 and 200 meter record holder. He's a four-time national champion in the 100 and 200 meters, three-time OFSAA champion, and OFSAA record holder. Austin's coming off a career year where he finished fourth at the 2019 WPA World Championships, just narrowly missing out on a bronze medal. Austin, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you being with us.
No problem. These are always fun to do, podcast kind of style. It's always just fun to get a new outlook on everything. Always good practice in general, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate that. And so I'll get right into our questions because I know I want to respect your time. I know you're a busy guy, and I really want to kind of profile you as a person before we get into your athletic endeavors. So can you kind of go through your upbringing and kind of what brought you into or made you pursue the sport of athletics?
That's sort of a two-part question, but yeah, we'll touch on the first part of that first. I'm born and raised in a very small town for a lot of people, perspective wise, who will probably be listening to this. I think population now is about 17 or 18,000. I still remember when it was down at 11 or 12,000. So growing up in that, you definitely make your group of friends and stick pretty tightly with them. So my group of friends tended to be the more athletic type of people in general. Soccer was what I grew up playing most, actually, playing midfield mostly. And I think it was through that people started to realize that I might have some decent potential in sprinting. But my philosophy on it for a very long time was, well, it's all right to be the fastest or one of the fastest kids in a small town, but what does it really mean in the long run? Mm-hmm. And then after years of persistence on their part, I finally pretty much caved and decided to try track in grade 8. It ended up being more of a it was a bet of some sort. I don't remember what the exact bet was. It was, I bet you X amount, whatever, you'll win the county. It was something along those lines. And I thought this was a very easy bet to take because I just didn't think there was any chance whatsoever. Never ran a track race in my life. Pretty much sticked exclusively just to playing sports with an athletic group of friends. Never pursued anything seriously. So I took this thinking it was pretty safe bet. And then flash forward 6 hours later that day, and I was out ×2 since I had ended up winning at 1 and 2. So it's crazy how the world works sometimes.
Yeah, and it sounds like it was almost you were a little reluctant to kind of try it out. Where you kind of just like you mentioned, you just wanted to stick with soccer and didn't really know if you'd even enjoy track.
I think it's a culmination of a few things. I think, like I said, the first thing about me is that I'm just an extremely competitive person in general. And I'm the kind of person who I don't do things halfway. I'm either all the way in or I'm all the way out on something. And being very unfamiliar with track as a whole, it's something that I'm always hesitant to commit to something until I have at least a decent background in that thing itself. And also, as I said, I had it in my mind that it's all right being the fastest or one of the fastest kids around in a small town, small group of friends, but what happens when you enter the bigger cities into the equation, the different schools, et cetera, et cetera. So I just don't really think I realized the potential I may have actually had in the sport, and I was reluctant to commit and assume that would happen if I became obsessed with the sport without actually realizing how far I could make it.
Okay. And would you say it's now kind of bordering, I mean, obviously as an elite athlete, I think everyone's a little bit obsessive over their sport, but would you say you're at that point now where you can see that now being a long-term, sort of goal for you or plan for you?
I think I've been at that point for several years now, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Like I said, I don't really do things halfway. As soon as I get entrenched in something, it tends to become fairly all-consuming, and I am a perfectionist at the highest of levels.
And I think, I mean, to that point, I think that is what makes you such an elite athlete, and will help you to continue to grow into the sport. You're 18 years old.
Yep.
Yep. So still relatively young, and we were just talking offline a few minutes ago. But how do you see that trajectory for yourself? I mean, we're looking at a typical sprinter to peak between 24 and 28 years old. So you still have a number of years before you get to that point. Where do you see that going, or what are your sort of long-term goals, moving forward?
Shorter term Tokyo, I've said to everybody who would listen, I would get on the podium. I said I would do it. I still plan on doing it. COVID doesn't change anything about that. I'm very confident in that prediction. I've pretty much called my shot so far, so I'm going to hopefully do that again. And then my goal would be gold in 2024, 100%. Closer to my peak at that point, gold in 2024, and I'm chasing Jason's records.
Very nice. Very nice. And you mentioned COVID there just a couple seconds ago. How has that affected your training?
More so near the beginning, for sure. There was a solid few months at the beginning where I was pretty much exclusively doing hard circuit workouts. So it definitely limited it that way. But one of the bonuses about being from a smaller community is we were one of the first places to reopen a lot of Ontario. So I had access to the track since early May, I think, early to mid-May, somewhere around there. So it took the first couple of months out of me, but it wasn't too bad aside from that.
Okay. And you mentioned a few times about being from a small town. What's that been like? I mean, kind of going back to your upbringing a little bit, but what's that been like for you in terms of training partners? I mean, obviously, it certainly helps as an elite athlete to have elite training partners. How has that impacted you, or how have you sort of worked through that to ensure that you're able to optimize your daily training environment?
The honest answer to that is where you work with what you have. There are some fast guys here. There's definitely, I hate saying things like this because there's just no way for it to come across right. There's definitely a significant gap between myself and the field in my given events around here. But in saying that, there are ways to work with that, right? If you're doing, I don't know, 200 repeats, say, you let the say X and Y take off 2 to 3 seconds before you even chase them, right? Like there are ways to work with this at all times. When we're doing starts, you'll just put your blocks back a bit further. There are plenty of ways to adapt it to make it more challenging to get that optimal feeling you described earlier. Obviously, even better if you don't have to adjust. But if you have to adjust, I mean, adaptability is a trait that is very important both in sport and in life. So if you can take that lesson early on, that's not a bad thing either.
That's fair. And I think, I don't know that it's even necessarily, a bad thing. Ultimately, an elite athlete is an elite athlete. And so you're right. I think that's a fantastic comment, just adaptability, being able to modify to ensure that you're, again, optimizing what you have within your community and within your club and that kind of thing. So that's great. So I want to touch on you being a T13 athlete. So obviously as a visually impaired athlete, you face some unique challenges. So can you speak to some of those challenges, how you've overcome them? And then I've got a second part of the question that I'll ask you following. So
segued this very well off of adaptability. I give you full props for that. I have no idea if it was intentional, but that was a very smooth transition on your part. I would say, coming back to that, the most difficult thing is, at least mentally, and physically there are some other challenges for sure, but I think mentally the hardest thing is going to new competition venues that you haven't been at. There is a lot that you need to get a feel for pretty early on, I would say.
Okay.
It's like I've always said, I love racing in Ottawa. I've raced at that track so many times, I could probably walk with my eyes closed at this point. So, I mean, it helps that way, right? When you know the exact layout, this is the entrance, this is the exit, bathrooms here, facilities here, X, Y, and Z. I think one of the hardest parts, as mundane as it sounds, when you're at a new training facility, is just finding all of those smaller little things. It's not the racing part is easy, right? You get on a track, wait for the gun goes, stay in your lane, right? Like, it's not, the racing part isn't that complicated. It's everything else that goes into pre-race, which all of those little things can definitely accumulate mentally. So it's important that you make sure those are on point before you ever step on the track.
Got it. And so, you've now been, you've been an elite, competing internationally now for quite some time. Is that something that you have to, you did talk about it, but do you consciously, go to the track a little bit earlier to learn sort of the way the track works and where everything is? Or is it just kind of you show up, you kind of figure it out on the fly and go from there?
Anytime the option is presented, I'm definitely there as early as possible.
Okay.
For the World Championships, we were very lucky because we had basically, I think it was a starter session is what they called it, where basically about a week before opening night of the World Championships, we were allowed into the actual stadium to do a full walkthrough and to do some starts out on the actual track. So that was helpful. Not every meet does do that. There are some meets, like off the top of my head, the World Grand Prix in Paris. I didn't get to see the racing facility until the day of. I was only allowed in the practice facility. But anytime that it is an option, it's one that's definitely something I'm trying to take advantage of.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. And you mentioned just a little bit earlier, every track basically once you get into the blocks, it's all the same. And so for those who don't know, can you speak to a little bit of the way your classification works? And I mean, people will notice right away that you're visually impaired, but you don't run with a guide runner. So what does being a T13 sprinter mean versus another classification?
So they do this in general in the Paralympic system, regardless of the disability, where they'll usually have 3 or 4 classifications per disability. And it's the easiest way to say is that it ranges on severity. So for visually impaired, it's T11, T12, and T13. T11 is you have no vision at all, or very, very close to no vision. Even the ones who have virtually no vision, even they have to wear something to obscure their eyes, basically. That way it's a fair playing field between them. T12 is sort of your middle ground, where you don't necessarily need a guide, but many of them do choose to run with a guide. T12, it is optional. You can run with a guide. You can choose not to. T11, it is basically forced upon you, which at that point is probably for the best. And then T13 is essentially the least impaired of the 3 classes. So we would not have the option of running with a guide, even if we wanted to, but that wouldn't be something I would ever want to pursue anyway, because that looks like a whole other challenge that is unnecessary.
That's fair. And so, I think kind of continuing on that train of thought, what are some misconceptions, again, because a lot of probably people who don't know para-athletics all that intimately. So what are some common misconceptions you've found, in your time of being in track and field?
I mean, I think we brought up the most obvious one already, which is the guide runners. You've definitely had that, right? Where it's like, I've been at a high school meet and it's like, we'll be in the 200 final or something, and I'll end up winning the 200 final, and they'll be like, well, what? Like, he doesn't have a guide runner. How is he this and that? But I don't think people realize that there are different classification systems in general, which kind of, yeah, that's just a whole. I don't begrudge anybody that, though, because frankly, it is a ridiculously complicated system to somebody who hasn't delved into it. Like, there are a lot of layers to the system itself. I think one of the other ones I've seen is that it kind of hinges on classifications again, but is that all of the disabilities kind of race together. I've seen that where it's like a lot of people will think you just line up and go, and it's not that complicated. Or sorry, when it's much more complicated than that. Right. I think the classification system in general, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, if I have this, I should show up in race and say that I have this and whatever. It doesn't work like that. There are a lot of very treacherous hoops you need to jump through in order to get to the end of that obstacle course. So,
right. And can you speak to some of those, or do you mind speaking to how over the years you've had to be classified, obviously nationally, internationally, to be able to compete?
Yeah, you have to do first off, which is a national classification, which is an extremely basic thing to do. Get one or two pieces of documentation and do a very brief test. For me, I can't speak to the other classifications because it's different on different disabilities, etc. But for me, it was a very basic. Think typical eye test, and it was that.
Okay.
International classification is a whole lot more complicated. You need to find a meet that actually hosts international classification, which, to use a common cliche, is frankly like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And even once you get there, the classification system itself is very flawed, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay. Did you have some challenges? Obviously, like we don't have any meets that have international classifiers in Canada. So was it a struggle, I guess, at first to either go to Arizona or go out to Europe to get that classification?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's unfortunate because you have to, if it doesn't work for you at that time, you're essentially left to hang and dry. You have to hit a very select few meets, so it is definitely challenging to get to the right meets at the right time.
Right. And I guess I'll just update the viewers for those who don't know. There's only specific meets that qualify to have international classifiers. So for a lot of athletes looking to become classified, they do need to travel quite significantly to get to those meets. And from my experience as a technical lead within the system, there are athletes, and Austin, you can probably speak a little bit to this as well. Like there are certainly athletes who spend the money to do all that travel. They show up and meet, and then they get classed out of the system, which is a whole another challenge in and of itself. But certainly, yeah, I can appreciate that. It can be very costly just to show up and then be classed out. So that's certainly something that can prove to be a challenge.
Yeah, the cost is a whole other thing altogether. I was extremely fortunate because I was already pretty deep in the Athletics Canada system at this point, so I had my expenses paid for. But if you're not that deep into the system and you want to get it, it's going to be a hefty chunk of money out of your own expenses.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit. We started off talking about sort of your past and how you've gotten to where you are today. But can you tell the viewers, what are your future goals? We'll start with athletically, but then also personally. Obviously, you are a person outside of being an athlete, and so where do you see yourself longer down the road, and what are your passions? What interests you?
As I said, the thing is with me is I'm a very obsessive, very goal-oriented person. So it's difficult for me sometimes to step back and look at the bigger picture because I'm extremely hyper-focused, I suppose you could say, on meeting the goals at that moment. But I mean, athletically, it's pretty simple. It's what I said earlier. I want the Paralympic gold medal.
Mm.
I want the world record in the one. I'd like to get it in the two, though it's scarcely raced nowadays, so it'll be a challenge to find a meet to do that. But yeah, I'd like to definitely conquer those two disciplines, and then I'm not really sure if this falls into athletically or personally because it's a bit of a gray area in between. But It's something that a lot of us have talked about within the Canadian Paralympic system, and something that I've seen brought up quite frequently globally as well, is that preferably just I'd like to be one of the people who help to usher the sport more under the mainstream media. Because, I mean, the way I say this already, and before I want to preface this by saying that I'm not including myself in what I'm going to say. I'm fortunate in the fact that I am not, my disability does not stretch to the point that it prevents me from doing a whole lot of things in life, realistically. Will it make certain things more challenging? Absolutely. Does it make them unassailable? No. However, there are plenty of disabilities within parasport. The go-to example for me would be many of the people who race in wheelchairs and the like, where because of said disability, their financial opportunities outside of track and field are very limited.
Right. Okay.
Yet, this is a very complicated system, but there are, of course, Paralympic sport and Olympic sport are two different entities in overall, as much as we would like to integrate them, right? So if you look at the Olympic athletes, because of the mainstream exposure they get, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're not disabled, whatever. It's just because they have more mainstream exposure. And obviously, this is a business at the end of the day. So the more mainstream exposure, the more advertisements, the more sponsorships, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to usher Paralympic sport into the mainstream, be one of the people to do it, simply for those people who don't have the financial opportunities outside of the sport. That way, when they're in the sport, at least that way, they can have the sport be more beneficial to them on a long-term basis. And so they can actually get more out of said sport. Because, speaking as somebody who knows a fair number of Olympic athletes and Paralympic athletes, the financial opportunities are drastically different in the two fields.
Oh, absolutely.
Which again is, I completely understand it. It's a business, right? But slowly but surely, if we usher it more into the mainstream, those financial opportunities are naturally going to grow because we're going to suddenly be a more profitable investment for other businesses. So it's just a process.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. And so do you see that? I guess you're starting that now, obviously, by having these conversations, being an elite athlete, being someone who hopefully, again, next year will be really on the world stage, winning a medal. But you see that then transitioning as you enter your later years of being an athlete. Do you hope to transition that into, a goal after sprinting, or is that something, you want to do now as an athlete because you're at the forefront?
I mean, I'll always do what I can to further it at the end of the day, right? I mean, I would hope that by the time I'm not planning to retire anytime soon. I'm 18. If I can do 20 more years in this sport, I'll do 20 more years in this sport. But I mean, we'll see where we are at that point. Obviously, I mean, I certainly hope that a lot is going to change between now and then. But at the end of the day, I mean, no matter how far it's progressed at that point, there's always room for improvement. There's always room for further progression. So,
yeah, absolutely.
If I'm afforded the opportunity by Athletics Canada, by Athletics Ontario, by WPA, whatever body organization, after I lace up the spikes for the final time, if I'm afforded the opportunity to further progress the sport, I will do whatever I can to further progress the sport. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what opportunities are presented.
Right. That's fantastic, and that's I think that's good because so many athletes, I guess you can say it as they define themselves as being an athlete, and that's what they are, and that's everything they do. And sometimes there isn't that greater outlook or greater cause. So I can certainly appreciate that, and I'm happy that we're on talking about this today, so that we can share that message and hopefully get that ball rolling, even if it's a minuscule amount for you. So I can certainly appreciate that.
I've quoted this several times in several different emails or podcasts, but one of the best quotes I've ever heard, and I say this every time, I don't know who the quote originates from. I'm sure it's decades and decades earlier, but I hear Chael Sonnen say it a lot. He's an MMA analyst. And he says, many of the elite athletes in a sport will look at a given situation, and their thought process going into said situation will be, how can I better this? How can this situation benefit me as a whole? The great athletes in any sport will look at that same situation, and their outlook will be, how can this situation benefit the sport, and how do I guide the situation in order to do that?
That's actually fantastic. I do really like that, and that's a great outlook, and that's a great perspective on it as well. So kind of, continuing on this path of being an elite athlete, I think a lot of us have seen that race here at the WPA World Championship race last year. And, it was one of the most fantastic finishes I think a lot of people have seen in a sprint, because you were pretty far back off the gun. And that last 40, you really had it going, and you were right there challenging for that medal right at the line. So, what was that first experience like for you, and what was your takeaway from, the whole experience, but also that race itself and finishing fourth in that race?
Touch on the race itself first, because I think it's an easier place to start at.
Okay.
Takeaways from the race were several things, but I think the best way to preface this is saying it wasn't a great race. It really wasn't. And I'm not the kind of person to come on here after and say, if I did this, this, and this, I would have medaled, whatever. No, I'm not here to say that. That isn't what it is. I mean, props to Jason, Chad, and Johannes, but at sea in Tokyo. But there was the time was all right.
That was the Canadian.
The time was all right. It was, yeah. Well, it was around the same time earlier in the year, but it hadn't been in a para competition. But yes. But people, to get the point to people, and I've both in and out of track, and I think it's a universally thing that can be accepted, is it was a fast race, but it was not a good race. The time itself was fine. Like the race itself, even the outcome, fourth of the world champion, I'm not upset with the outcome whatsoever. What upset me about that race is that I spent several months preparing for that exact race, yet the execution was actually very poor on my part. There were several mistakes in that race that some of them, don't get me wrong, are fairly complicated mistakes that it's fairly acceptable to make at that point. And several things in my left arm fall into that category. Several things in my ankle positioning fall into that category. But there are other things that are just blatant day one errors that I should have never made on that stage, glancing over my left shoulder in the last 40 meters, by example. So there are a lot of things that from that race that, from a technical standpoint, I realized I needed to patch very quickly, because those are just mistakes that you cannot be making at that stage.
Do you think, sorry to cut you off, but do you think they were just a byproduct of, the situation and the pressure and that kind of thing? Like, do you take that as a experience, or was that, how do you take those sort of mistakes?
I understand this is going to be a very unpopular opinion that many people do not share, but I've said it before and I will say it again. There is no such thing as pressure. It is the biggest myth and the biggest misconception in all of sports. It does not exist. It is placebo to the highest degree. I have never bought into pressure. I have never felt pressure. It is not there. Anybody who blames a performance on pressure, they need to look at their own mental outlook on said race and change how they perceive the race and how they analyze the situation, because pressure itself is not a tangible force. There's no way to quantify pressure. You cannot point to anything in pure pressure is different. This is a different categorization. When we're talking about pressure in sports, it is one of the most used terms in any sport. Name a team sport, name an individual sport. There is nothing you can point to, or anybody can point to, and say, this causes X amount of pressure. It does not exist, and that alone proves it's a subjective point. It is a subjective point based on each person and how they perceive the race. That alone means it is not tangible. It doesn't exist in the way that people think it does. As soon as people understand that pressure is not a force that needs to exist, it will very swiftly stop existing in their competitions. Now, there are some people who need to feel what people would commonly say is pressure in order to get their own adrenaline up or whatever it is. If you're one of those people, absolutely keep telling yourself that. You do what works for you at the end of the day. That is the name of the game. One of the most common cliches I've heard is it's 50% mental, 50% physical. I think 60-40 in terms of mental is actually far more accurate. So if you can, whatever works for you, do it. But just know that pressure is not a thing. It doesn't exist. So I blame absolutely none of it on pressure. That is 100% my own technical faults at that point. There's no mental error there. I just needed to work on certain areas that I neglected pre-race.
Sure. And, that's an interesting outlook, one that I haven't heard before, but also, it parallels, I think it was the basketball player Damian Lillard, who said, I play basketball for a living. This isn't pressure. It's the single mom, that's real pressure, trying to figure out, how you're going to raise a family and feed a family.
And that's why I specified in sport.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we're very privileged, I was just about to say, being involved in sport, that we can do what we love for a living, or we can do it full time. I think to your point, pressure is absolutely subjective feeling versus an objective. Like you said, X. This causes X amount of pressure. So that's definitely a fair assessment. Again, one I really haven't heard before, but. I think, do you find that outlook helps you then on bigger stages?
I can't honestly tell you because I've never not had it.
Sure.
It's not something I developed over time. It's just something I realized that the first time I ever competed in anything, I was waiting for it to hit me, waiting for it to hit me. And it's this entire thing is a myth and misconception that is 100%. I've said it before, and it's a blunt way of looking at it, but my honest opinion on pressure is that in sport, again, financial pressure 100% exists. Peer pressure 100% exists. Within sport, I firmly believe that pressure is a term that was created by somebody 100 or so years ago who showed up to a competition, didn't do nearly as well as they thought, and needed an excuse. And now it exists more in the fact that the placebo effect is a very strong thing. If you believe in something, that thing will exist. So when people say they feel, people say my performance was sloppy because I felt pressured, though I do not support the excuse whatsoever, or do not support giving a justification in that sense, I don't think they're lying. I definitely don't. I'm sure they did feel that, but the only reason they feel it is because they buy into the propaganda that's just been blasted out about this. It's like you can take the placebo effect and apply it to a medical field. There have been legitimate tests where people have had these terminal illnesses, and one of the most decorated doctors in the country or the continent will come into the room and tell them that they have this magic fix, and it'll be completely made up. There's no validity to it whatsoever. But they tell this person this, and they give them this fake medication that doesn't work, and all of a sudden the illness starts clearing up because they think it's going to clear up. It's the same thing with pressure. If you think it exists, it is going to exist, but it only exists because you as a person, you believe it is there, you accept it is inevitable, and you allow it to happen. That is the only reason it exists.
Interesting. Very interesting. I like that outlook. That really is a unique outlook. And sorry, going back to the second part of that question, just your experience, how was that experience? Aside from, the obvious, the technical mistakes that you just referenced in the race itself.
I love the experience as a whole. I have absolutely nothing bad to say about the experience, even the race. I mean, as much as I would have liked to clean some stuff up and possibly medal, whatever, at the end of the day, even the race, I mean, we win or we learn at the end of the day. I learned a lot from that race. So even that wasn't a bad thing necessarily. It wasn't the ideal execution that I was going for, but I mean, you can find a silver lining in most situations. But the experience as a whole was absolutely incredible. It was my first major team competition with Team Canada. I'd done international stuff before, but it was much more independently. They
Okay.
funded it, but it was much more you go with your coach, whatever. Where this one, it was a team of 28 people, a staff of IT, several coaches, biomechanists. Like we had the whole team out there, which
Okay.
was that alone was an incredible experience because, I think as an athlete, it's one thing to always see these professional athletes on TV and people say, oh, all their needs are attended to, this and that. It's one thing to actually hear about that, and it's another thing to experience that altogether, where that it very much is how it is. Hey, I have a twinge here. Okay, do this, this, and this, and this is going to be fixed. Okay, we're going to help you by doing this. Like the actual team with AC was absolutely phenomenal for that entire experience. I mean, if you had a problem, it wasn't a problem that lasted very long because they fixed it as soon as humanly possible. So that was incredible. The sense of community there was also great for me because, again, first major team experience, right? So I hadn't met a lot of these people. I'd met most of the Ontario people. I'd met most of the people who were training and racing out of Ontario, but a lot of the others, I'd never met them before. So I think it was really cool that way to meet, 20 or so new people and get to know them on a personal level, because anybody who's competed in sports knows there is nothing that brings a group of people closer together in a shorter period of time than throwing them in a major stage and having them work together to support each other in those goals. So It was definitely cool that way as well. And then, I mean, I'll take a free trip to Dubai anytime it's offered. I'll just throw that out there.
How was Dubai? Must have been a fantastic place to visit.
It was. We didn't see. I got a little bit unlucky with this, where I raced on the second last day of the World Championships, so I didn't really want to do too much before that. Just one, mentally, two, physically. I didn't want to fatigue myself at all. So I got the short end there. I did, my draw wasn't perfect, but the limited amount I did get to experience in Dubai was incredible. And as a person who loves heights, Burj Khalifa was fun.
I can imagine. I'm the opposite, so I would have kept my feet firmly planted on the ground.
Yeah, that's fair. No, a lot of people didn't do it. It's fair.
So we have a couple minutes left. I'd like to ask this to all the elite athletes we have, in these webinars. Tokyo next year, Tokyo 2021 now, obviously with the postponement because of COVID. What do you need to do in the next, I guess, 10 months to be on that podium next year?
Adaptability. I've said it before. It's going to be the key to the situation. We don't know what's going to happen 5 days from now, let alone 5 months from now. I mean, the numbers in Ontario are going up right now. People have talked about potentially going back to stage 2. People have talked about a vast number of things. So the reality, I'd love to sit here and tell you that I have this all figured out and that there's some master plan in place that's going to get me on the podium. The reality of the situation is I would be lying to your face if I did that, and I have no desire to do that. So I'm going to work with the situation as it comes. I think I've proven over the years, both in athletics and life, just with the disability, to be a fairly adaptable person. So I'm going to try to be as adaptable as possible. It's one of my coach's biggest strengths. So we're going to get there.
Fantastic. One last one. It actually came in from the AO community, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I just want to address it. Biggest hurdle for you mentally when preparing for competition, so we can phrase it in the perspective of Tokyo. What will be that biggest hurdle for you mentally leading into to Tokyo to overcome?
Don't overthink everything. It's a habit. Again, I've said it before, I'm a perfectionist to the highest level. Anything, it doesn't have to be at a meet. It can be something at a practice. If I can't get a technique down, it will drive me absolutely insane for the next several days of my life. The story I tell is my first training camp in Grenada with a biomechanist. It was just a little thing. I didn't dorsiflex properly in certain impacts, it's a certain point of impact. Sorry. So I spent, I think, the next 6 hours walking around my room, just dorsiflexing every time my feet hit the ground. Like I'm that kind of person. So I think the biggest thing for me is, we're going to be trying to make some major technical changes before Tokyo. So the biggest thing is don't get caught up in your own head along the way. It's perfectly acceptable to not master a major change in technique in the first 3 days of doing it. So
Right.
I think that's it for me. Just don't overthink all the little things along the way. Just have faith in the process. Have faith in your coach, who's done nothing but be incredible so far, and you'll get there.
That's fantastic. Well, Austin, I really, really appreciate your time today. Again, I know you're extremely busy. The life of an elite athlete is hectic, to say the least, I'm sure, but we sincerely appreciate your time. And, you will build a lot of fans through this podcast for sure. And, I hope that Athletics Ontario can continue to share your story, continue to share, your belief and desire to put the para community at the forefront. So absolutely, any way we can help you do that, we'd love to continue to help. Did you have any closing comments you wanted to leave us with before we sign off?
Well, in light of COVID, I suppose we've talked a lot about mental preparation, so I'll leave one thing that I didn't really get to mention on here. I've heard it brought up a lot in 2020 where everybody says they're struggling with motivation, whether it be for sport, whether it be for academics, whether it be for insert avenue here. I'll just leave it up here, and I'm not trying to be a motivational speaker here, but I think I have some outlook on this, and I have done some public speaking, so we'll call me one for the next 2 minutes of my life. I think it is perfectly acceptable to feel drops in motivation in 2020 with everything going on, but just every single person who feels that, I would encourage those people to find a method in which to negate that effect. So for me, by example, I've said it before, I'm a very goal-oriented person. So for me, it sets smaller goals along the way, whether it be athletics, right? There are no meets to prep for, or you don't know, you can't say my goal is to finish here, my goal is to run this time. So you take it very simply. My goal is to do this number of sets today. My goal is to do this today. It's the same thing in academics, right? I want to learn this today. I want to accomplish this, etc. Anything you want to do. Set smaller goals along the way if you're a goal-oriented person. If you're not, just think of what drives you as a person. Why are you doing this? And then think of ways you can encourage the desire based on what you're trying to do. And we should all get through this absolutely miserable 2020 and hopefully come out the other
end. That's fantastic, Austin. Really appreciate it again. Thank you for that note. And hopefully we'll be seeing you soon on the TV and around AO track meets. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Colton.